And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Robert Darnton. Robert Darnton is currently the Carl H. Pforzheimer University Professor and Director of the University Library here at Harvard. Educated at Harvard and with a PhD from Oxford University, Professor Darnton began his career with a brief stint in journalism, I think it was 2 years, before returning to academia full-time. He was on the Princeton faculty as a European history professor for almost 40 years, and he took up his current post at Harvard in 2007. Professor Darnton's many scholarly works have focused on French cultural history and the history of the book. In 2005, he received an award for distinguished achievement from the American Printing History Association for his pioneering work in that field. He currently has several new books out, demonstrating both arms of his scholarly interest. In The Devil in the Holy Water, he explores the role of slander in the fomenting of the French Revolution, a topic which is also the center of The Bohemians, a revolutionary-era French novel with a new translation out edited by Professor Darnton. And in The Case for Books, he looks at the history of the printed word and its future in an increasingly digital age. And now please join me in welcoming Robert Darnton.
Well, thank you. Thank everyone for coming here. I'm grateful to have a chance to talk about books. You are book lovers, I think. This is a nice setting to discuss them. And somehow it turns out that I've published 3 books in the last week or so, and they're books about books. So this is a bookish occasion, but I think books are a lot of fun, so I hope you won't feel it's too heavy-going and academic. I especially want to thank Jeff Mayerson and to wish him well. This is an independent bookshop. It's a center of sociability, intellectual life. Bookshops matter, especially independent ones. So, Jeff, you are the salt of the earth, and good luck to you. Right. So 3 books about books. What we are not doing is having a funeral for the book. I think this is a time to celebrate books. But I've been invited to so many conferences on the death of the book that I think it must be very much alive. It reminds me of one of my favorite graffiti, which is in the Princeton University Library in the men's room on the 2nd floor. You may have seen one like this. It says, "God is dead," signed Nietzsche. You know it, right? And then underneath someone writes, "Nietzsche is dead," signed God. Well, the book is not dead. It doesn't follow that it's having an easy life, but it really is thriving. I've got some statistics which I will not share with you, but what's interesting is that the number of books published each year increases, and the graph goes up and up and up. When last measured, it was almost 1 million new titles worldwide per year. 1 million new titles. I mean, the book is doing very well, thank you. And the notion that, everything is digitized and the codex is being replaced by new media is, I believe, simply crazy. Not that I'm against digitization. On the contrary, we're doing all we can to forward it at the Harvard University Library. But my point is, well, it's a lesson I think we can learn from the history of books or the history of communication in general, namely, one medium does not displace another. We found this out in the case of, radio did not displace books, and television did not displace radio, and so on and so on. In fact, we now have pretty good, hard, scholarly evidence that Gutenberg's great invention did not at all displace manuscript publishing. As you probably know, manuscript publishing in the 15th century was a big business, and there were almost assembly line scribes who are copying at a furious rate in scriptoria. They we're doing very well, and I think the invention of movable type, or the reinvention of movable type by Gutenberg, stimulated manuscript production. It didn't wipe it out. A recent study by Harold Love, a very fine English scholar, has demonstrated that manuscript publishing thrived throughout the late 15th, the 16th, the 17th century, and well into the 18th century. And a friend of mine, now dead, Don Mackenzie, argued that it was cheaper in the early modern period, right up into the 19th century, to hire scribes to copy out books if you were producing an edition of less than 100 copies. So scribal publication continued very well. And not that I can extrapolate easily from the past, but I really think that digital publishing, the books that you will be reading online, are going to reinforce publishing through print, and that there's a great future actually facing publishers if they can get to people like you through the digital means, whet your appetite for a book, and then persuade you to come to a place like the Harvard Bookstore and buy it. Or, who knows, you might use the famous machine down in that corner. I don't know if you've seen it yet, the espresso book machine, which is an example of how the new technology can reinforce the old printed codex. What do? Well, you want to order a book, let's say it's a book in the public domain, it'll be virtually free, or a book that's in print but whose publisher has agreed to play ball with this new machine. So you order it, you contact a digital database, the book is downloaded on the computer here instantly, and within 4 minutes it is printed out, trimmed, a paperback cover is attached to it, and you walk off within 4 minutes with a brand new paperback under your arm. And the cost is quite reasonable. It varies, of course, but it's an example of how this kind of electronic technology can reinforce the traditional book. So I think we're living in a very interesting transitional period in which the new technology and the old technology, Gutenberg and all that, are thriving together, but no one quite knows how it's going to work out. When I was an undergraduate, I remember the first time I walked up the steps of Widener Library, and I looked up at those columns and I thought, here is all of the world's knowledge packed into one building. A splendid building, rightly situated at the very center, the heart of the campus. But that, of course, was a grand illusion. Even then, Widener did not contain everything. We now have 16.3 million books in the whole Harvard University system, and if 1 million new books are being published every year, you can see how far we are from having everything. We're not a deposit library. We're not the Library of Congress, but we are the largest university or library in the world by far. So it's a great monument to the printed word and to other forms of communication. However, as I say, that freshman sentiment, walking up the steps into a kind of temple of learning, was, if you like, a grand illusion. And it's not shared, I think, by freshmen today. We have some here. Well, I should ask you later on. I think most freshmen today feel that all information is online. And that, too, is a grand illusion, because, of course, it isn't. So we've got to work our way through these, if you like, colossal cases of collective false consciousness to a greater understanding of things. And that's what I'm trying to do in the first of these 3 books that have come out. This is called The Case for Books, and it deals with a series of interconnected issues. I'm simplifying slightly, but despite I'm sounding optimistic about the case for books, and I'm convinced that the Codex is one of the greatest inventions of all time, and that it will continue indefinitely. Despite that, I think it really would be naive to say that Booksellers, publishers, authors, even readers have it easy. These are hard times, in fact. Why? Well, because of a series of interlocking problems. Just looked at from the perspective of the world of learning, university presses, graduate students, students of all kinds, you could begin with the spiraling cost of scholarly periodicals, especially but not exclusively in the hard sciences. Some annual subscriptions to periodicals cost more than $30,000. Several cost more than $10,000. And we at Harvard have to buy all serious scholarly journals because we have to keep up with everything. And if we started canceling subscriptions, our faculty and students would revolt and I would be strung up by the nearest lantern. So we're trapped. And in fact, some of these publishers use what we call cocaine pricing. You price a journal at a reasonable level, the readers get hooked on it, the libraries buy it, and then you start jacking up the price, and we can't unsubscribe because everyone wants that journal or wants a bundle of journals, and so on. The result is, not here at Harvard, where we're continuing with difficulty to buy books in large numbers, but elsewhere, many university libraries are canceling monographs. The journal proportion of their acquisitions is simply squeezing out the book sector. In some places, I won't name them, but they're well known to librarians, instead of a 50-50 relation in acquisitions between journals, periodicals, and monographs, it's 80 or 90 to 10%. So libraries are no longer buying books in large quantities. And that means that serious publishers, especially university presses, are selling fewer and fewer. And they have given up publishing monographs in many fields. Colonial Latin America, for example. If you're a graduate student in colonial Latin America, you can't get your dissertation published. And no publishing, you perish, as the slogan goes. So there is a kind of ripple effect that is moving throughout the world of learning in which everything is connected with everything else. But it seems to me the new technology is a ground for hope. My own ideal, if I'm speaking as a specialist in 18th century studies, is what the 18th century called the Republic of Letters. It's a republic with no police force, no boundaries, complete egalitarianism, anyone can participate. It's where talent counts. In the 18th century, as I've tried to show in earlier studies, this was an ideal that was very far from reality. In fact, authors and publishers and so on were always fighting, and life was pretty nasty, actually, if you were trying to make it in the Republic of Letters in the 18th century. But today it seems to me that we've got new possibilities of really reviving this Republic of Letters thanks to the new technology. So we have this espresso book machine, but we've got many other things as well. It seems to me that there will be a reorganization of the modes of production within publishing. Warehousing will be cheaper, transport will be cheaper. You will be downloading and digitizing and transforming into printed works all kinds of books, I think, in a way that will be simply wonderful and that will open up and democratize learning. That's what we're trying to do also in the Harvard University Library. I mean, if I had one word to describe the sort of policies that I'm trying to promote, it would be openness. We have an open access program that was voted by the Faculty of Arts and Sciences 2 years ago now, and that means that all new scholarship in the form of articles, scholarly articles, will be put on an open access repository made available free of charge everywhere in the world. I've created an office for scholarly communications, which is disseminating this work through the repository and is also planning to expand things so that we will have dissertations digitized and available free everywhere. We will have what's called gray literature also available. That's, well, casual talks like tonight's. Why shouldn't something like this be made available if anyone wants to see it? Or work in progress reports, or for scientists, all kinds of labs, lab work for which they keep logs. The possibilities are simply fabulous. So I think Harvard should open itself up, share its intellectual wealth, and be part of this digital future. That brings me to the subject of Google. Now, I will try not to go on and on about Google. It's true that Google apparently thinks I'm its enemy. It's wrong. I'm an admirer of Google. I think Google is wonderful. I admire it so much and think it's so good that it's dangerous. Because, of course, with this power, the attempt to monopolize access to books and the whole world of information, Google will have the ability to indulge in cocaine pricing. And I feel that we have to have guarantees against that. We need the public authorities to prevent this magnificent thing called Google Book Search from exploiting the public by demanding too high prices through its subscription service, which it will launch. I even think that it could be in the interest of Google to moderate its pricing and to turn itself into a national digital library. That's what this country needs in the world of books. It can be done. President Sarkozy in France announced recently that 750 million euros would be made available to digitize the patrimony of France. Why can't we do what France is in the course of doing, and what the Dutch are doing, and what some of the Scandinavians are doing? It's not easy. It's going to require a lot of effort. It will even require the changing of our copyright laws. Now, copyright is another vast subject. I won't go on and on about it, but I'm trying to show how all of these subjects that I try to discuss in this book are linked. So as some of you may know, the history of copyright goes back really to the Statute of Anne in 1710 in England, but the key turning point was a case in the House of Lords in 1774 where it was determined that copyright would not be eternal. It would be limited, and the limit would be 14 years renewable. Well, the founders of our republic copied the notion of copyright from the British, and our first copyright law, which is entitled for the stimulus of knowledge. I haven't got the quotation exactly right, but for the forwarding of knowledge, for the encouragement of knowledge, that's it. The copyright law of 1790 was 14 years and another 14 years renewable, a limit of 28 years, which I think is great. But the 1998 copyright law, the Sony Bono Copyright Extension Act, known as the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, makes copyright last for the life of the author plus 70 years. That's more than a century in most cases. And why? Well, in part because Mickey Mouse was about to fall into the public domain. So Hollywood mobilized, and now we've got a very poor copyright law, which is not encouraging the spread of knowledge at all. So we need changes in the copyright law. We need changes, I believe, notably in the regulation concerning so-called orphan books, which I could discuss later if you like. I don't want to go on, and I would like to mention the other book, which I'm publishing recently. It's got I like titles that are sort of amusing, and I would like the text actually to be, if possible, amusing. I mean, one of my ambitions is to make my reader laugh aloud. I don't know if I've ever succeeded, but I would be happy if I could sit in the, let's say, the reading room of Widener and watch a student read a book and laugh. The power and enjoyment of laughter, I think, is just a wonderful thing. So, well, maybe it's not going to make you laugh, but the title is The Devil in the Holy Water. Then I have a subtitle that explains, or the art of slander from Louis XIV to Napoleon. It is a book about what the French called in the 18th century bad books, mauvais livres. Another expression for them was philosophical books. So the police call them bad books and the readers call them philosophical books. They combined wonderful ingredients. They were anti-religious, they were seditious, and they were what we would call pornographic. So they made terrific reading. They were, in fact, bestsellers. And I've brought two of them along to show you. Maybe this, you can't see it perhaps too well, but notice the size of this book. It's a book that could be sold sous le manteau, under the cloak. So imagine a peddler coming up to you and saying, "Psst." And you open it up. Of course, it wouldn't be bound, probably. It would be stitched, perhaps. And it's got a very provocative frontispiece. You can't see it maybe from back there, but it shows a journalist, a gazetier, who is firing off cannon shots at everyone, and especially the powers, the evil powers of Versailles, the old regime up above. It is a wonderfully wicked book and very funny. I won't go into the details, but you get the idea. It was what the French called a libel, a libel. Well, I had done a previous study of forbidden books in which I tried to come up with statistics, and I was able to trace the demand for 720 titles. Of the top 12, 5 were libels, and I never heard of any of them. They're all anonymous. None of them exist in histories of French literature. They've simply disappeared from what people think of as the literary history of France. But in the 18th century, people loved them. They sold like des petits pains, wonderful, delicious little biscuits, if you like. And it's clear from the correspondence of booksellers, I've read 50,000 letters of 18th century booksellers, that these books sold like crazy. The public wanted to read about, here's another nice title, The Private Life of Louis XV. 4 volumes. And it's full of sex, but it's also full of politics and even philosophy. It's a fascinating work, very well written. We have a copy of the translation of The Private Life of Louis XV into English here in Houghton Library, and on the top it says, G. Washington. We have Washington's copy of The Private Life of Louis XV. And it's not altogether surprising because Washington wanted to read about all the sex going on in Versailles and the Parc aux Cerfs, as did everyone else. It's a terrific tale. So my argument in this book is that this literature, which is enormous, deserves to be taken seriously, even though librarians didn't necessarily stock libraries with it because they thought it was, well, trash. Trash is interesting. We need a history of trash. We should take it seriously. Why? Well, because in part, the police of the old regime took it seriously, and not just the police, but Louis XV himself, and Madame du Barry, Madame de Pompadour, all the ministers and mistresses and so on who are dragged through the mud in books like this one. All of these people saw it, first of all, as horrible and wanted to protect their name, but more than protecting your name and your reputation, you were protecting your position in a power system. These books, the libels, here's the second I wanted to show you, and it has the same title. It's called The Devil in the Holy Water, Le Diable dans un bénitier. So I've cribbed the title from this actual book, which was a very important libel in the 18th century. These books that revealed all about the private lives of people in power were seen as powerful themselves. And what I try to do, aside from analyzing their character in general, is to show how the regime reacted to this literature of libel. Partly because it demonstrates the importance of it, at least as seen from the perspective of people in power, but also because it's so much fun. I believe that as a writer, I want to write for the general educated reader, not just for other college professors. So I hope that the reader will enjoy the tales of how the public authorities in the 18th century tried to suppress libels, because it's full of hugger-mugger. There are simply amazing stories of kidnapping and assassination attempts, of secret agents, of the agents of the Parisian police disguising themselves. They like to call themselves baron, as false barons, and with a big expense account. They go to England and they try to capture libelists, to hit them over the head, put them in a boat, take them to the Bastille, and get them to squeal about their sources of information and the whole production system that produced these best-selling libels. I won't go on and on about the adventures of these people, but it's a lot of fun. And this book in particular, the French version of the original Devil in the Holy Water, tells the story of the attempt of the French police to capture libelists. The book was written, they're all anonymous, by the way, and they're written by people that I'm sure you've never heard of. In this case, the author is one of my favorite characters from the obscure areas of French literary history. In fact, virtually no one has heard of him, or of the book I'm about to mention, which is the third and last, translated into English, The Bohemians. His name was Anne Gédéon Laffitte, Marquis de Pelleport, the Marquis de Pelleport. He wrote this book, The Devil in the Holy Water. He wrote at least a half dozen other libels. He was the most terrible libelist that the French police ever ran across. He was hiding in London, and he had the English Channel between him and the Bastille. He also had the benefit of really virtual freedom of the press as it existed in London, and frankly, the British couldn't care less if libels were being produced in London and smuggled into France about the secret life of Louis XV and Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and all the rest. In fact, they were at war with France. It was our war that gave us independence, and it was a terrific time for the life of a libeler. So this fellow, the Marquis de Pelleport, was churning out libels throughout the 1780s, and he was only one of a whole colony of French expatriates who made this their specialty. The book sold very well, as I said, but they also were excellent for blackmailing the French. And so Pelleport wrote a letter, I'm a loyal subject of the king, and I've discovered to my horror that a terrible subject is about to publish a book about the queen and the king and their relations or their lack of relations. And it's really distressing. For a certain sum, every last copy of this edition could be destroyed. So there's a wonderful blackmail operation that kicks into full gear. And without going into the detail, the police finally, not having succeeded in kidnapping Pelleport, or they didn't manage to buy him off for a whole series of reasons, lured him to Boulogne-sur-Mer to France, the French coast, and captured him. They threw him in the Bastille, where he sat for 4 years. Now, 4 years is a long time for a prisoner in the Bastille. The normal period was about 4 months. It's not a modern prison. You know, the modern concept of prison doesn't exist. So he was one of very, very few prisoners who stayed more than a half a year. He actually stayed 4 years and 3 months. He arrived in 1784. He was released in October 1788. As you may have heard, the Bastille was nearly empty on July 14th, 1789, when the French crowd liberated it. There were 7 prisoners in the Bastille at that time. The Bastille in the late 1780s was not full of people. Just a handful, really. But one of them was my man Pelleport, and the other, who was there for exactly the same amount of time, who also was a marquis, who also came from the ancient nobility, the old feudal nobility, and who also was writing novels, was, of course, the Marquis de Sade. So the Marquis de Sade, everyone knows, and so on. He's writing these wicked books in one cell, and Pelleport is writing a wicked book in the other cell. And this is the book, The Bohemians, Les Bohémiens in French. It is a truly mauvais livre. It's a bad book in that sense of the word. And I found out, to my astonishment, while tracing the lives of these libelers, that no copies of this book were available. I could only locate 6 in the world. Not a single copy in Paris, only one in France, actually in Rouen, the municipal library of Rouen. It's a book that completely disappeared from French literary history, just as the author Pelleport disappeared. But when I finally got my microfilm copy from the municipal library of Rouen and started reading it, I thought, this is a masterpiece. This is a terrific libertine novel. Now, masterpiece is too strong. I really wanted to believe it was a masterpiece once I got into it. But it's an incredibly interesting book. So I managed to persuade Gallimard in France to republish it. It's just appeared, I think, yesterday or the day before in Paris. It's been published in Dutch, and it's now available in English. I recommend it strongly. It's a little shocking in places because it outdoes Sade in the description of sex. It's not violent. There's no delight in the suffering of others, but it is very sexy, it's very wicked, it's very anti-clerical, and it's full of information about the life of hack writers, because Pelleport was one of them, and it turns out it's a roman à clé, that is to say, a novel, it's a picaresque novel that's full of information about these hack writers that Pelleport himself knew, including the whole colony in London, some of whom went on to be leaders of the French Revolution. The most important one is Jacques-Pierre Brissot, but another is Marat. So there's a lot to be learned, as well as a lot of fun to be had from this whole world of books from 18th century France, which, thanks to the richness of the archives, is available for research and now available for reading. It sounds like a commercial. I'm not really trying to persuade you to buy them, but I am trying to make a plug for the history of books. I think it is the most exciting field in the humanities. It's a field that is just bursting with energy, new ideas. It's very active here in Harvard, but it's everywhere in the world, actually. China, for example. So the history of books is, I think, an example of how new life is being infused into the humanities with new techniques and new ideas. We're going places. And I hope that the Harvard University Library will be at the heart of this revival of interest in books, the old-fashioned book, as well as the new digital book. Thank you very much. How can you be sure of the authenticity of the text? Again, I'm speaking as an admirer of Google, But Google's like a bulldozer, it just brum, digitizes everything. It digitizes by the shelf. I've seen them do it. I was allowed to watch the process of digitization. It's terrific. That's the only way you can digitize millions and millions of books. But your objection, I think, is valid because Google doesn't ask, what is the best edition? Is this edition valid? Does this edition have all of the volumes announced in it? Middlemarch is lacking one of its volumes in the version that appears in Google Book Search, et cetera, et cetera. Now, another great thing about Google is they say, right, we move fast. We just plunge in, and then if we make mistakes, we will correct them. So I admire their willingness to take the plunge and then to correct things. There's hope that we will get better editions. However, they, as far as I know, have no bibliographers, no concept of the integrity of the text. Instead, it's information and massing information. So that has its advantages, it has its disadvantages. And what I hope is that we will have a national digital library that will do the job right. I hope that it'll happen with the help of Google. So Sergey Brin, if you're listening, help. And I think that Google, with the collaboration of university libraries, bibliographers, book people who really understand books, could use its database, not for books that are now in print, commercially available books, as Google calls them, but rather for books that are in the public domain, as they're already doing, and then books that are out of print but in copyright. If we could take all of these books, that would be the totality of books in the English language up to 1923, which is when the copyright laws get tricky. It would be fabulous. So Google, I think, would not lose anything by contributing to this cause, and we would all gain. So the question, in case you didn't hear it, is it the case that there are more books but fewer readers, and could there even be students who go through Harvard without reading a book? That I doubt, frankly. But it is true that students specialize early, and some of them, read online. They read snippets frequently, or they read extracts, or they read articles sometimes. But the notion of cover-to-cover reading, continuous reading, and reflective reading, what I call slow reading, maybe that's not a losing cause, but anyhow, it's retreating. When I was a student here, there was a wonderful professor, Ben Brower, who was a champion of the new criticism. And this is when speed reading just was being offered as a technique. And Brower said, no, we need to slow down. I mean, I think in general, in America, we need to slow down. Why read fast? Read slowly, enjoy it. Let your fantasy roll. Well, I doubt that we have so much of that kind of reading today. It's a loss, I think. However, the history of reading itself is an aspect of the history of books, or vice versa, if you rather. And we've discovered lots of things about how people used to read books. They actually read snippets frequently in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. We have a fabulous collection of so-called commonplace books in Houghton. So Thomas Jefferson reads a book, he copies out a passage. And then he uses that passage later when he's writing something else in his law practice when he was a young man. Books were often not read from cover to cover in the 17th century. They were read for ammunition to be used in political battles and ideological warfare. So the history of reading isn't this wonderful sort of paradise we have lost, but rather a very uneven terrain in which there were lots of ups and downs. So who knows, maybe our ability to do word searches now will open up a new kind of reading, but I share your worry. I wish I could offer some higher wisdom on the topic. Speaking as a grandfather myself, I also worry about the amount of time twittering and that sort of thing, especially if they're texting and driving. I mean, my grandchildren aren't nearly that old, but how will it work out? I honestly don't know. I think that it's difficult to predict. Whenever I try to see into the future, I look into the past and use it as a kind of rear view mirror that's projecting things onward. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think that we can demonstrate a lot of reading in the past was, so to speak, in snippets, that people didn't start at the first page and read their way through frequently, but they read for specific passages which they could use for specific purposes. That's one kind of reading. There were many kinds of reading. In fact, there's a debate among the historians of reading about a so-called reading revolution that took place in the late 18th, early 19th century. The argument is that before then, there was so-called intensive reading, in which people would have one or two books, the Bible and, say, Pilgrim's Progress, and they would read them over and over and over again. And then, as books became less expensive, people became more educated and wealthier with the kind of consumerism that began in the 18th century. Instead of reading books more than once, they would read a book and then race on to something else, so-called extensive reading that was, some would argue, more superficial. I think that thesis is wrong, but a lot of other historians of reading think I'm wrong. So we've got a debate around that kind of thing. Now, that's not an answer to your question. I honestly don't know what will become of our grandchildren as they Twitter and text and all the rest of it. But I do feel that there's something so powerful and persuasive about the Codex, that is a book made out of pages, that they'll get it. They'll get it. And the sheer force of this invention will make itself felt. So I see complementarity rather than contradiction. I think it's conceivable that in the very long run, that we will have a new sort of technology that could replace the Codex. I find it hard to believe, but I think it is indeed possible. So it could be that 20, 50, 100 years from now, we will live in an entirely digitized world. The technology changes so fast that it's difficult to predict. But one thing we can do is to follow the changes in the technology. I mean, this is maybe a little simple, but I love to cite turning points. So 4000 BC, you get the invention of writing. About 1000 BC, you get the invention of writing with an alphabet. Around the time of Christ, you get the invention of the Codex. That with Gutenberg, you've got printing with movable type. So, you know, we're collapsing time. And then the internet dates from 1991. The beginnings of the ARPANET, as it was called, I think from 1974. And reading with, search engines and relevance ratings and that sort of thing, that's yesterday. Google exists since 1998. So we are, I think, living through a time of increasing technological change. And I believe that it is a change now that is so rapid and pervasive that it is comparable to the change produced by Gutenberg and company. And so, yes, maybe you're right. Perhaps 20, 50 years from now, the printed codex will cease to be a force. I hope not, but it could be. So the first question had to do with research methods, and the second with censorship. It's very clear that digitization is opening up new possibilities for research. So let's say you're not used to computers, but you are interested in words. You can do word searches and look at semantic fields and discover at what point in time certain words began to be used. Since I've been talking about bad books, I'll give you the example of the word pornography. You know, it's not used in the 18th century. It begins in the 19th century. or the word bohemians. And I think bohemianism as such, Puccini and all that, is a 19th century phenomenon. But what I'm trying to show here, and also in the novel, is that the word was used. You can find the expression bohemien in several places in the second half of the 18th century, and the title of Pelleport's book is Les Bohémiens. Well, with a proper word search, maybe we could get a really very interesting account of how that word, when it first was used and how it developed. That kind of research you can do without a lot of fancy technological knowledge. I think you'd find it useful. As to censorship, well, the settlement that involved Google's case and the authors, that is the Authors Guild and the Association of American Publishers, who sued Google for breach of copyright. This thing we call the settlement gives Google the right in the corpus of digitized books that it is creating to eliminate any books it wants. So Google, I call this censorship. That is to say, Google can decide not to make books available on its database. Now, the settlement does say if it makes such a decision, it will announce it and make the digitized version of this book that it's eliminating available to something called a book rights registry. Okay, that's a little better, but the book rights registry isn't going to have a database. So it could be that Google as a business will not want to publish anything critical of, say, China. Well, you've probably followed Google's relations with China recently, and Google was permitting China to censor its general searching facilities, and finally said enough is enough and that it will no longer do this. I applaud Google. I think that's wonderful. I mean, really, I do admire Google. But they were censoring for quite a while in the hope of penetrating into the Chinese market. But if you've got a monopoly position and you have the right of censorship, that's dangerous. So some monopolies could be good in the sense of providing good services, but monopolies tend to charge monopoly prices and to abuse their power. So we need, I think, a public authority that will prevent those abuses. First of all, it's clear that Pelleport and Sade wrote their books while they were prisoners in the Bastille, but I've done a lot of research in the papers of the Bastille. Not all the papers have survived, so it's a little tricky. But in the case of Pelleport, I found a specific reference to one of the, not the guards, but one of the officers of the Bastille saying, we will make paper and pen and ink available to the Marquis de Pelleport. The Bastille had a library, and they could read books there. It even had, in 1788, a billiard table. And so I imagine the Marquis de Sade and the Marquis de Pelleport playing billiards. Now, I can't prove it, and in fact, I can't prove that they ever met. But they were there for 4 years, and we know that some of the prisoners were allowed to take walks in the garden of the Bastille, etc. We know that they exchanged notes in the chapel, for example. I think it's inconceivable that they did not know each other. It's just that I think my man, Pelleport, was a much better writer. But that's up to you to decide if you want to compare their novels. Now, as to the buying of books in Houghton Library and our special collections in general, because we have at Harvard many special collections in many different libraries. In fact, I'm often asked, how many libraries do you have? I asked the question myself when I first arrived here, and the answer was, well, some say 40 and some say 104. That was embarrassing if you had to, explain what the library system was all about. We have now decided we have 73 libraries. It depends on how you define a library. But certainly many of these 73 libraries have their own special collections, and Houghton is the flagship of special collections. We are not going to cut back on buying rare books, on buying important books. Our donors are very generous, actually, and we have many graduates who are willing to give money so that we can continue doing this, and we buy manuscripts. So John Updike's manuscripts are here. Wasn't easy, but the graduates of Harvard rallied round, and now we have a magnificent John Updike collection, both his books and his manuscripts. And I could go on and on. Yes, it's very complex, but some donors create endowments, and the income from those endowments keeps it going. So we depend on gifts, of course, but we also have regular endowments, and we have a magnificent staff in Houghton, which is cataloging works and taking good care of them, and even teaching. I mean, I teach a course, and some of the students are here. They know that these Houghton librarians can teach you a lot. So we are trying to make the most of this talent that we have in the library in all respects. Well, the short answer to that is yes, but it's a very, very good question, and it keeps me up at night. Because it's true that most works today are born digital. I mean, virtually every writer writes on a computer, and the text is in an electronic memory. Now, it can be printed out and so on, but publishers are working from these electronic texts. So even in the case of ambitious full-scale books, there is a problem of preservation. In the case of ephemera, the problem is enormous. So we have, for example, well, email. Most email is disappearing, has disappeared. The email from the White House between 2001 and 2005 apparently has disappeared. But there was also the case of the census of 1960. I don't know if you've heard of this. This is the census of the United States, which was kept on magnetic tapes, I believe, anyhow, some kind of electronic storage. And it was thought that the entire census was no longer available because of the extinction of these archaic kinds of tapes and hardware and software. Well, I mean, if we lost a whole census, that would be serious. In fact, in 1976, a whole corps of engineers was able to reconstruct the census, but it was not easy. So we've had spectacular examples of lost electronic data. And then if you think of all the eyesites just in Harvard, at Harvard University, I don't know how many there are, but practically every professor has his or her website. Many have several websites. The websites are often incompatible, not interoperable, some with the others, and they come and they go. So at the library, we feel that this is valuable material. It's of a high scholarly value in many, many cases. So we are now developing programs to capture the email of Harvard, just of Harvard, but we're talking about millions of email messages, and to capture websites. It's an elaborate program, it's a costly program, but we feel this is part of our responsibility. And a lot of this will go into this Office for Scholarly Communications that I mentioned and the electronic repository it keeps. But you're absolutely right. No one in this country or in the world has solved the problem of digital preservation. And it's not just that the hardware becomes obsolete and that the software becomes obsolete, but it gets lost in cyberspace even if it hasn't eroded. You know, the zeros and the ones can unravel, so to speak. But we can't locate it if we don't have proper metadata, that is, a proper description of how to find it out there. So there are enormous problems in digital preservation. And I feel it's our responsibility to future generations to solve those problems. So we have something called the Library Digital Initiative. We have an Office of Information Services within the library with very talented computer engineers and so on, and they're working on it. Whether they'll solve it, I don't know, but I think that we need to have an R&D ingredient in the library system to expand and improve our digital infrastructure to really make us the most avant-garde digital library in the country, while at the same time buying all these printed codexes. Not easy. By guests of the government, you meant the Bastille and the prison. Okay. Of course, one of the definitions of a legal government is it has a monopoly on power. So when I refer to monopolies, it applies to that. Of course, governments tend to abuse their power. We have laws. We have a balance of power system, which is abused sometimes, but it's worked reasonably well. We have militant organizations, civil liberties unions. We have courts. And we have other possibilities. I mean, I'm in particular thinking of the Library of Congress, which is a fabulous library, by far the largest library in the world. Why shouldn't it's a deposit library, so every book that is produced is supposed to be deposited free of charge in the Library of Congress. Why can't it digitize its holdings, which is something around 30 million volumes? I mean, it's staggering. Why can't it do that and make sure that these holdings are preserved and made available for the country? Well, the answer is two problems. One, copyright. So you can't violate copyright in digitizing them if the book is still under copyright. And two, money. It costs a lot of money. However, my formula is let us have, if not a new copyright law. We've had 11 copyright laws in the last 50 years, one more complicated than the other. So let's at least have a law that covers orphan books. If we had such a law, then competitors to Google would be able to digitize books. But they can't, according to the settlement. Only Google can digitize these books and be protected from lawsuits. So orphan book legislation would make it possible for someone else to do the digitizing, and then a coalition of foundations, if not Congress, could finance it. And it could be, we wouldn't do it overnight, but we would do it right, and we would do a million books a year. At 10 years, we've got 10 million books in the public domain and in out of print, but in copyright books. It would be fabulous for the American people. And that's a small cost compared with one day in Iraq. So I think it is doable, but we lack the will. And so I hope that if Sergey Brin isn't listening, that Congress is, and that we should write to our congressmen and women and get them going on this, because it is doable and it does matter.